3. Hellblade 2 SENUA'S Saga was a disappointment, but you probably knew that already. What you might not know are the numbers associated with that disappointment. So here's some stats and a sprinkling of history. The first Hellblade, SENUA'S Sacrifice, was a taut feast for the senses that captured fans, won awards, and cost its developer Ninja Theory under $10 million to make. Purely from a business standpoint, it was a game created to be a game changer. Self-funded, self-published, aiming to prove that you could make a quote AAA indie game without the backing of companies like EA, Sony, or Microsoft. AAA indie is a dumb term, but the gamble paid off. Hellblade 1 took 4 years to make with a development team of 20. 8 hours long, it would cost you just £25 to play in 2017, and in its first year sold over 1 million units. $10 million is a lot of money, but not when it comes to game making, so the team relied on crazy out-of-the-box thinking like using IKEA furniture and taping GoPros together for the motion capture. It succeeded in what it set out to prove. I love it. Fast forward 7 years and Hellblade 2 SENUA'S Saga released after 4 years in the cooker and completely undermined the industrial success of the first game. The development team ballooned to 80, releasing a 5-hour game that was 30 quid more expensive than the first. Unless you have a Game Pass subscription, because Microsoft slurped up Ninja Theory for $117 million. To date, we don't know what SENUA'S Saga cost to make, but we do know it cost a lot more than its predecessor. And this sequel hasn't been nearly as commercially or critically successful, even with the boost of Game Pass. In fact, Hellblade 2 was such a disappointment that fans of Ninja Theory started to worry that Microsoft would shut the studio down the same way they hacked at developers Tango Gameworks and Arcane Austin. Online conspiracies and encouragements cropped up with people calling on each other to buy the game despite its status as an underwhelming sequel, just to save Ninja Theory. That fear seemed unfounded, and that's likely because Ninja Theory, in an effort to prove they were worth the Microsoft investment, doubled down on graphics with a capital G. The days of filming facial expressions in a boardroom to capture the suffocation and claustrophobia of its main character are gone. Now, it's all about the state-of-the-art motion capture studio. Now, it's all about one key focus.
We can push even further on our ambition of bringing through as much of our actors' performances as possible into the game, even down to the most nuanced of movements. We'll achieve a level of realism that will further immerse you in our story.
Try to get that extra fidelity of performance into the game.
You can really see every little face movement now, every little twitch.
We've really gone to town on our performance capture.
How does it look so real? I have to stop and go into photo mode to capture the moss on the rock that you've created.
Microsoft weren't investing in a game developer. They were investing in a visual effects department. As an industry, gaming's bubble is preparing to burst. Lengthy dev cycles, unrealistic expectations, trend chasing, and a foundation of corporate greed has led to layoffs left and right. But the primary failure of Hellblade 2 sits apart from this. It's not a cynical live service looter shooter like Suicide Squad. It's not a remake in a sea of remakes. It wasn't in development for 10 years. Instead, it failed because so much of its attention is focused in the wrong area. It forgets the humble beginnings of the first game and instead screams and yells about graphics. Fidelity roars like a troll over the combat, art direction, and storytelling. Going back to Hellblade 1 is so fulfilling, because when you peel away the layers that make up its immersion, it becomes more fascinating. But peeling away the layers of Hellblade 2 just shows how clumsy and uninteresting it is as a game and as a work of art. Drowning in swollen budgets and its desire to be lauded as the latest best looking game ever in a long line of best looking games ever. As Senua raised a rock above her head and the credits flashed on screen like a jump scare, I wasn't just disappointed, I was baffled. I squinted at the long list of people who poured their energy into this game, and I asked a question. Where did that time, that energy, and that Microsoft money go? The answer is simple, but the ramifications are gigantic. This is a commentary and critique of Hellblade 2 SENUA'S Saga.
So what were you unable to do in the first game that you're now able to do in Hellblade 2?
Oh, a lot. So let's start off with performance capture.
Let's start with the performance capture, studio head Dominic Matthews says, purposefully front-loading the conversation with discussions and stories about Hellblade 2's look. Despite the fact we're controlling a Pictish warrior who suffers from psychosis, warping and bending reality around her in a variety of styles that the original game embraced, our sequel is hell-bent on realism to achieve its believability. That devotion to realism destroys Hellblade's moment-to-moment pacing, and nowhere is that clearer than its underwhelming opening.
We'd found it. My father would be angry, but maybe there would be a way to take back what we had lost.
After journeying into the underworld and confronting Hela, Senua found peace. We learn that she chose to live, found another clan in the Orkney Islands, dyed her hair black for some reason, and settled down until the brutal and savage Northmen returned. She's let herself be captured so that she can track her foes back to their homeland. She believes that this is Midgard, the earthen realm of Norse mythology, but in reality, we're crossing the sea to Iceland. If the opening of the first game was calm and quiet, with the voices of her Furies hushing, whispering and welcoming us into the story, the sequel's opening minutes are filled with screaming and death. Both are connected by the thread of water, linking to Senua's inspiration, the Celtic goddess of water Senua. If it's purposeful, it's poetic, but its gameplay doesn't match its tone. This is an opening where you slowly, agonizingly climb up a cliff, crawl under a ship, and limp past some bodies. A tired, antiquated slog that's at odds with the yelling and screeching of the storm as it whirls around us. The backdrop is frenetic, the gameplay is not. Hellblade 2 immediately disconnects the player from Senua so we don't seep into her skin, we splash off of it. Ninja Theory's innovation swung entirely the other way for Hellblade 2. 42 top-of-the-line cameras were built wall-to-wall around a soundstage, something that the team claim is uncommon when it comes to performance capture. Laura Durham, lead writer and performance director on the game, walked through some of the changes Ninja Theory brought to Hellblade. Quote, "We shot the first Hellblade in the boardroom of our old studio. It was very MacGyvered together. In the new studio, we have a custom-built mocap space, which is pretty much everything we could have dreamed of. We've got projectors so we can recreate sets on the ground if we need to. We've got loads of props that we have available to us at any time so we can build sets." Senua's Saga released just 3 development diaries from its creation, a far cry from the 30 that accompanied the first game. All 3 of these diaries return to performance capture, animation, and realism, whether that's in our characters or in the country of Iceland itself. A lot of time was spent on climbing this cliff. A whole rig was built so that Melina Jurgens, who plays Senua, could be filmed rolling around on ledges and clinging to rubble in a really believable way, but the first 10 minutes of the game stand as a monument to how somewhere between the crying and the clinging and the rolling, someone at Ninja Theory should have asked, is this engaging? Note that I've used the word engaging there and not fun. I'm firmly of the belief that not every video game needs to be an astrobot, and friction is pretty damn great when it connects with a player, but there is no friction here, no tactility to how Senua moves. I am not climbing. I am pushing up on the analog stick. I am annoyed that the warrior who defeated Surt, leaped on Valravan's back, and scaled a mountain of bodies in the sea of corpses is struggling to crawl up a hill because the game is frankly too proud of how detailed the performance capture is and is forcing me to admire it rather than play the game. Yes, Senua is exhausted and hurt in this moment, so climbing the cliff would be slow and difficult. But it's not difficult. It's just holding up on the stick for 5 minutes before the game starts. Imagine if Metal Gear Solid 4 opened with Snake's radiator crawl rather than closed with it, and you would be halfway there. It breaks the immersion rather than embraces it. Wait a minute, you might be thinking, input-wise, this isn't any different from how Hellblade 1 opened, and you are right, but the simplicity of the input matched the feeling of the moment there. In Hellblade 1, Senua was paddling up a tranquil glass of a river while scanning the shore for enemies and listening intently to the Furies, so the gameplay being a simple directional button meant we could do just that alongside her. If this type of gameplay was limited to the first chapter, I could shrug it off, add Hellblade 2 to the growing list of great games with lackluster openings, but this insistence on forcing the player to a grind carries right until the closing chapter of the game.
Yes. You hear that? That's him. That's him.
Can you hear him?
It's no wonder people muled on Twitter that the game was just a walking simulator because our speed is regulated over and over again, forcing us to wallow in overly detailed animations or world design rather than just acknowledge it and move past it. This regulation is always accompanied by minimal inputs, and this is a 3-hour game stretched to 5 because of the speed. When we find the Blood Eagle, we're forced to walk. When we find the mirror, we're forced to walk. In the Draugr camp, we're forced to walk, crawl and shimmy so we can appreciate how the fire looks, and later, when uncovering the truths of the giants, we are forced to walk. Hell, even when we're doing something as simple as marching over the hill with Thorgester, we are forced to walk. God forbid we run past all the Unreal Engine 5 countryside, eh? Hellblade 2 adds to SENUA'S Psychosis by letting her hear the voices of the dead. She's a character burdened by guilt because of the years of brainwashing at the hands of her father, so following this shipwreck, the other slaves are dashed on the rocks and she immediately believes it's her fault. Wispy spirits crawl out of bodies, hissing and blaming her, something I'm sure you know already because the game slows us right down so we can get a good look. Thanks, game.
Halftime, I'm like watching, and I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to be pressing A right now. You know? Like that right there, I'm supposed to press A, but it doesn't actually tell you.
There's constant uncertainty about when the player is expected to interact. I found myself muttering, oh, I meant to do something here, far too many times, and often the something to do was pushing X once or pushing up on the analog stick. Take this segment when Senua crawls under the ship. A corpse grabs us, the water rises, oh god, oh wait, no, there's nothing I can do here. I've put the controller down and Senua's still moving. Must be a cutscene. Ah, but now my controller is going crazy with vibrations and Senua's stopped. What do I need to do now? Well, it turns out that this is a laborious sequence where Senua crawls without me and I press X when she stops moving. In an effort to make everything seamless and incredibly realistic, lengthy animations and all, there's a desynchronization between me controlling Senua and Senua herself. Something which, on a fundamental level, makes telling this story through the medium of a game pointless. Watching this footage, your memory might mislead you, make you think that Hellblade was always like this, but I can assure you, it wasn't. I went back, replayed and remade my critique of the game just to check. Just take this moment when Senua was injured by Hela on the bridge. She's battered and bruised, cuts mark her like fingerprints of the goddess, so she clutches her arm so we know she's hurt. But her speed does not change. We can move as freely and as quickly during this all is lost moment as we can anywhere else in the game. Hellblade 1 rightfully leans on its fantastic atmosphere and sound design to subtly encourage us to slow down or speed up whenever we think we should, rather than whenever the game tells us to. Hellblade 2 tells us to, also we can drool over the production value. And the worst part is, I think the sequel looks less interesting than its predecessor.
You, slave. Come here.
He's still alive. The enslaver. Remember, you need him alive. Don't kill him.
What are you going to do with that sword, girl?
He looks ready for
On the edge of the coast, with waves crashing and men dying all around us, Senua confronts the slave master, Thorgester. His crew are lost to the waves or Senua's blade, but he's still single-minded in his purpose. Gather slaves to gift to his father. Seeing him struggle with one of her clansmen, Senua cries out in rage. Thorgester readies his weapons and commences our tutorial boss. There will be just one other boss fight after this. The irony is that the slow pace of Senua's Saga doesn't deliver on a weighted, dense story. Despite being grander in scope and budget, pitching itself as an odyssey to distant lands where the first game had a more personal journey, it's also a more shallow game, leaving a lot undeveloped and, later, a lot unearned. The entire heart of the game relies on us believing, understanding and feeling Senua's rage, but it's raised and discarded too quickly for it to have any impact on the narrative. As a series, Hellblade has worked overtime to make us fear and despise the Northmen, but looking at the sequel, I think I hate them more than Senua does. She simply gives up on her quest for vengeance too quickly. The story treats Senua as a hero in need of redemption, capable of slipping into the role of a ruthless tyrant in just seconds. The teaser trailer doubled down on that imagery with the badass red war paint and angry chanting, but we never see that side of her aside from one quick hallucination later.
Where you come from, where you take the slaves.
I can't walk. How do you expect me to take you anywhere?
His pain doesn't matter. Make him walk.
You'll walk.
She has to save them.
Defeating Thorgester, Senua tunes into the Furies and decides that she won't cut him down. Instead, she'll force him to lead her back to his camp. At first, there's a sense that her plan is to cut the head off the snake, still on the path of vengeance, but 30 minutes from now, she will decide to untie Thorgester and form an alliance with him. When I criticize Hellblade 2's length, I mean that purely from an artistic perspective. It's not that the story's too short, it's that there's story missing. As far as I'm concerned, vengeful Senua doesn't exist. She didn't sail to Iceland, she was captured and taken here. She didn't hunt down Thorgester's crew on the beach, they just kept throwing themselves at her. She doesn't beat Thorgester down and force him to take her to his people, she narrowly survives his attack, ties him up for 30 minutes, and then lets him go. We don't control her, we don't hear from her, we're simply expected to get all of that pivotal characterization from the camera strapped to Melina Jurgen's face. And it's a great face, look how expressive she is, but the best acting in the world can't hold up a script that doesn't capitalize on its own subtext. She's barely angry, she's hangry at best. Which is a clumsy way for me to transition into this video's sponsor, Factor, chef-prepared meals delivered to your door. I'm the cook in our house, but by the time you're watching this, my wife and I will be days away from having a baby. That means I might not have the time or the energy for big shops or prep work. Takeouts are nice, but nobody's got the money or stomach for pizza 7 days a week. Enter Factor, fresh, never frozen meals that are chef-crafted and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. It's more affordable than a takeout and dietitian approved. If you're like me and live with a picky eater, there's all sorts of ways you can shake things up. They have a weekly menu of 35 options to choose from, catering to all kinds of dietary requirements. When things get hectic, like with a newborn baby, can you tell that I'm panicking a bit? Factor is flexible. Change your order up every week with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, or pause or reschedule your deliveries at any time. Every subscription supports the channel directly, so treat yourself and me. Get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor, and on with the video. Which brings me back to how the game looks.
You can see it. Do you remember it? She knows that suffering.
Here's a question. What do you think these black rectangles are for? This is called letterboxing, where the aspect ratio of a visual thing, typically a film, is shot using a widescreen lens and then played on a 16:9 screen. There are two arguments for why widescreen is so pervasive in the media we consume. The first is that human beings see in widescreen. Our vision is much wider than it is taller, so a filmmaker can compose a shot in a way that replicates the human eye. The second is that it adds gravitas to large, epic scenes like humongous battles. Helm's Deep is more powerful in widescreen than it is on a 16:9 TV. When it comes to games, we've typically seen letterboxing used when a game forgets it's a game and wants to replicate the feeling of film cinematography. Star Wars Outlaws did this because it was trying to mimic the sense of being a Star Wars movie. The Evil Within did this to replicate the feeling of a B horror movie. What separates both of these games from Hellblade 2 is that there, you can turn the letterboxing off. But in SENUA'S Saga, you're forced into this view and need to effectively hack the game if you wanted to fill your screen. Why is this? Do Ninja Theory think Hellblade 1 would have been better if it looked like this? Why does Hellblade 2 insist on these black boxes? The running theory is it's because of the Xbox. We've heard a lot this generation that the Xbox is difficult to optimize for and isn't powerful enough to run some of the latest tech. See Black Myth Wukong for the latest example. Hellblade 2's letterboxing uses up over 28% of a 16:9 screen, meaning that's 28% less super duper photorealism that your Xbox needs to process, pulling the field of vision back so everything on screen is technically smaller. If those theories are true, there's an irony there. Hellblade's hyper-focus on graphics is ill-suited to the console it's being made for, and the narrative direction suffers for it. Widescreen might be better suited to shots like this one, but it's ill-suited to a claustrophobic, harrowing trip in the mind of someone who suffers from psychosis. The first game was rigid with pressure because of how often we were close to Senua, filling the whole screen. The limited scope and budget meant that she was the only character picked up by this performance capture tech, meaning often the camera became a character, leering and pushing in on Senua during her trials. Now, the camera is focused on sweeping vista shots and detaching itself from Senua to give us pretty bits of framing, like here with Thorgester. I'm not sure what the purpose is of the stuff it carries over from the first game, like structuring itself as a one-shot that heightened that claustrophobia, if its insistence on looking like a movie is going to constantly undermine them. I mean, at least it's pretty. Look at how great this rock looks. Once again, Ninja Theory partnered with 3 Lateral for their game-changing motion capture, investing into that partnership in ways that illustrate their long-term goals as a studio. But as impressive as that technology is, our over-reliance on it means Hellblade 2 loses its most powerful imagery from the first game. There is no live action this time. This was a thrifty way for Ninja Theory to bring in a cast of characters in SENUA'S Sacrifice. It was brilliant, and weird as fuck. I have this shot of Druth drifting out of the darkness and whispering in SENUA'S ear seared into my brain because of how it breaches the uncanny and feels eerie. It looked great and blended with SENUA'S worldview, so we could catch a glimpse of what her psychosis does to her perception of other people and her memories. Now, all of that is gone, replaced with reported terabytes of data, despite the fact Ninja Theory created costumes and pleated Melina Jurgen's hair so she could get a feel for the character before filming. Costumes created for unfilmed cosplay. The live action isn't the only thing cut from this game, and we'll get to the combat later. Oh boy, we will get to the combat. But it seems like since confronting Hela, inexplicably, Senua has actually lost over half of the Furies that haunt her. In Senua's Sacrifice, she had 13. Chipo Chung, Helen Golan, Abby Greenland, Mark Graham, Isabella Marshall, Sarah Owens, Tom Penn, Becky Wilkie and Edward Wren all lent their voices to give texture as the unnamed Furies. Oliver Walker soothed Senua as Dillian. Ellie Piercy taught us lessons and endured torture as Galena. Stephen Hartley's Zimbel brought a vibrating bass that chilled us. And Nicholas Bolton comforted us as Druth. It meant they never got stale or irritating, and they were constantly worth listening to, even if it was just for the variety of sounds. Now the 13 has been cut down to 6. The unnamed Furies have gone from 8 to 3. Only Chipo Chung, Abby Greenland and Helen Golan were brought back. Druth is relegated to collectible hunting and an underwhelming secret narrator role. Galena and Dillian have been erased completely, a creative decision that you could wave away by saying it's because Senua let them go and came to terms with their deaths at the end of the first game, but I don't think that argument holds water when the game drags Zimbel back to retread old territory.
You should not have come here, child.
Zimbel, or the Shadow, took the physical form of Garm in the first game. He was the final boss of Senua's Sacrifice, luring Senua into literal darkness to convince her that she was cursed with a spiritual darkness. Senua beat him back and found clarity as her sword pierced his skin, remembering the abuse at his hands and connecting the trauma that stems from his murder of her mother. Now, he's back to torment her, accompanied by mockingly saying that she never left him behind, weakening the power of that moment from the first game to serve a secondary theme that only appears in the 11th hour, that Senua might have her father's cruelty inside of her. Again, this is something that is only suggested rather than explored, and feels like a bolt-on to the game's main focus, that behind every monster lies a man. There could be a story about Senua reverting back to her vulnerable self in the first game, but if that's the case, I need to know why. What triggered his return? Is it just the unfamiliar surroundings of Iceland? Hellblade 2, for all of its claims about being bigger and shinier than its predecessor, is more interested in streamlining the experience. Despite being $30 more expensive, there's simply less game here. It's shorter, there's less fully formed gameplay sequences, there are less bosses. The live action has been cut, the Furies are down in number, the story is thinner. But it's in the combat that we see the game's biggest setback.
There's something here. I need to find out what it is.
They're dead.
You're mad.
She's not mad. Doesn't see the signs.
Don't make sense.
Thorgester leads Senua across Iceland, hiking towards his home. It turns out that he's not just a slave master, he is in fact the son of a Viking lord, known only as the Goti. A village screams ahead, roars of suffering and death draw Senua away from her hostage. She knows there's something or someone deep in the village that she needs to find, but there's a horde of Draugr between us and our goal. Originally, the term Draugr had a coffin load of connotations. It could have referred to both trees and ghosts, depending on the context or the poetry. But over time, they've become a lot more zombie than ghost. In her essay, You Can't Keep a Dead Man Down, Draugr in Lore and Life, Laurie Wood writes, "The first and greatest problem with using the word ghost to translate to Draugr is that while they are necessarily capable of passing through the solid earth and stone of their burial ground, and some few also have the knack of shape-changing, Draugr are quite definitely solid creatures. This is literally a dead man walking. Hellblade 2's Draugr, just like God of War's, just like Skyrim's, just like every other time they've walked on pixels, are drooling feral beasts. Senua views them as supernatural monsters, but in the context of Iceland, they are Viking cannibals who have formed their own tribe. It's one of the more ingenious parts of Hellblade 2, the way our primary enemy faction is painted against the backdrop of giants, volcanoes, and Iceland's politics means we can believably fight a terrifying force of nature that meshes with Hellblade's combat style. And that is where my praise ends. When it comes to enemy variety, SENUA'S Saga is a victim of being a sequel. There are expectations you develop for an action-adventure series where a successive entry will bring cool new fights and cool new enemies. Concept art littered the halls of Ninja Theory during development of the first game. Wisping wraiths, beastly riders, opportunities to play around with what Hellblade 2 can do and what it can be now that the team have got the basics down. But just like everywhere else, the combat is a visual step forward and 2 mechanical steps back. The game gives us standard grunts, axe throwers, fire breathers, spear enemies, shield enemies, and feral ghouls. 6 enemies split across 2 factions, similar to the enemy variety from the first game, while also not differentiating enough for them to matter. The shield bearers only appear for one fight 40 minutes before the credits roll. The feral ghouls suffer the same fate in the Cave of the Hidden Folk. The grunts, axe throwers, and fire breathers remain a constant throughout, but it's only really the fire breathers that require a change in strategy because they're so fast, have such range, and force us to roll rather than parry. There's a couple of short sections, like flashbacks, where Senua is thrown into battles from the first game. I don't want to see any comments arguing I'm too harsh on the sequel by comparing it to its predecessor, by the way, because the game devotes a cumulative hour to wanking itself off over how great Senua's sacrifice was. During these flashbacks, fractured mirror-like enemies leap out of the darkness and hack down on us, reminiscent of the brilliant ethereal enemies from the first game that couldn't be hurt unless we delivered a charge attack, a perfect parry, or slowed down time. In Hellblade 2, that mechanical complexity is gone. We don't need to think differently for them, we just need to mash the square button because it turns out they're just regular grunts with a unique look. Striking them chops pieces off, a really powerful and cool effect that looks great, but classic Hellblade 2, there is nothing to chew on past the visuals. All of this I could forgive. After all, I really like the first title's combat, there's only 5 enemy types in that game, but the core foundation of Hellblade 2's fights are a joke or a disaster or both. Before we get there though, we've got a new friend to meet.
What is your name?
Senua.
I've been waiting for you.
This is Fargrimr. His name means Wanderer's Mask, the second of 3 pals or Pictish lass will meet over the game. He's the one who has ideas, and more than anyone else, seems to share a snippet of Senua's Psychosis. He introduces himself by speaking to the camera, as if he's telepathically transmitting his thoughts to Senua. He tells her that he's been waiting for her, and immediately, Senua feels pity for him. Deciding Chapter 2 is the point when the quest for vengeance that barely started ends, and her quest to save the Northmen begins. After all, in her darkest hour, an outsider saved her, the wild man Druth. Oh, whoops, sorry Fargrimr, you'll need to wait. One of the Draugr have knocked Senua to the ground, so that means combat's begun. Every single fight opens with an ambush, and that is not an exaggeration. 100% of our battles kick off with a lengthy, photorealistic animation of Senua getting knocked to the ground, or tackled, or grabbed, or bitten, or kicked. They're always scripted. Nothing the player does influences the type of animation we get. It kinda sucks to see the warrior from the first game reduced to Tomb Raider-esque torture that the game seems almost gleeful about. We're not just talking a quick knockback, parry, or deflection to set the tone of a fight, we are talking numerous instances where Senua gets smacked around, pants and cries on the floor, and then climbs to her feet. The most frustrating part is that these are often our reward for defeating an enemy in combat. Returning to that frames per second interview I referenced earlier, Dominic Matthews said, "The big change from Hellblade 1 to Hellblade 2 is that in the sequel we asked, how do we make every fight tell a story? Here's the story that Hellblade 2's combat tells. A Draugr screams at Senua and she trips back. She stabs it in the head and another one jumps on her back biting her. She cuts it down and another one chews on her shoulder. On and on and on it goes. It frantically impacts the pace of fights because it never feels like a fluid part of one big combat sequence, it feels like constant interruptions by the game out with our control. It's used so often that it became predictable long before the halfway point, and psychologically disconnects from Senua's combat prowess. I might dodge and slice an enemy, but it's just going to end with another Draugr bumping into us. Senua is a less wary, less capable fighter in the sequel, and because Ninja Theory are so determined to over-script its combat encounters with unique animations, their combat mechanics suffer. Every fight is now a one-to-one brawl. No longer are we juggling numerous enemies at once so fights can organically up the tension and pressure. No longer are we needing to rely on the Furies to give us directional hints as to where enemies are coming from, meaning they just become irritating noise during battles that I refuse to heed, once again separating me from Senua. Her sword from the first game, Gram, a shining blue mythical blade, is also gone, and it seems like it's taken a lot of combat mechanics with it. Senua can't kick anymore, something that added dynamism to facing off against shield enemies. She can't do a charge attack anymore, something that dealt major damage, quickly refilled her focus meter, and could pierce ethereal enemies. Sprint attacks have vanished, an agile flourish that made Senua feel speedy and precise. What's left behind are sluggish, hyper-detailed animations that take agency away from a player, and a parry that is broken because it's at the behest of over-scripted fights. The visual impact of a parry is less explosive and less crunchy than it was in the first game, meaning you don't feel half as rewarded for pulling it off, and I'm convinced it's pre-scripted when the parry does and does not work. Sometimes the game ignores the input when it really feels like we should have deflected an attack, and sometimes Senua will parry when it really feels like I messed up. Get good, you might say. Well, let me direct you to Exhibit A. Hellblade 2 comes with an autoplay mode that lets the game fight for you. This footage of the Draugr camp is using that autoplay to prove my point. I have put the controller down and I'm just watching this fight. This is what optimal play apparently looks like. Senua is still getting knocked about and is hardly ever executing parries in the name of giving us the illusion of a tense, difficult combat encounter. In fact, I counted 8 times in a row that she went to parry an attack, but the game just executed a block. I'd be the first to admit when I suck at a game, but I never felt like something went wrong because I cocked up here.
Alongside head-mounted and motion capture cameras, we're taking a filmic approach to our cinematics with a bespoke virtual camera setup.
We've got Bosch's camera in here, it gets timecode jam here, and we track this crown in relation to this offset marker here so that we can track the point of the lens, and that allows us to faithfully track the camera's lens and look throughout the scene.
Ninja Theory spent 69 days capturing combat. First off, nice. Second off, I consider that time wasted. So much attention was spent on getting fluid animations that never repeated, all in the name of spectacular, brutal combat. But just like everywhere else, the spectacle isn't enough to hold up what is ultimately a combat system that is somehow simpler than what we got in the predecessor, and constantly pulls back the curtain so we can see the cogs underneath because it keeps ripping control away from us. Ninja Theory is an action-adventure studio. Heavenly Sword, the DMC remake, and there were a heap of ideas left on the cutting room floor of the first game, like ducking or mirroring attacks. I simply do not understand how we got here, but all signs point to a hyper-focus on realism.
That wound looks bad, Thorgistur.
I don't want to talk to you.
If you accept my hospitality, I can have it treated. You will not make it far alone.
I will come with you, but this changes nothing.
Seeing the horrors of the Draugr, we bring Fargrimr back to Thorgestur. The village of the Red Hills is just over the ridge, so the trio decide to head there to lick their wounds and regroup. Fargrimr and Thorgestur have been in conflict for some time. Fargrimr doesn't agree with taking slaves, but Thorgestur argues that it all serves a grander purpose. A greater threat looms over Iceland, a monstrous thing, the giant Eiltoiga. So, let's talk about the game's Spooks.
Now, some of us, we hide.
You have to fight, not hide.
Make defenses, struggle on. And some of us use others to stem the tides.
Others? What do you mean?
Shall I tell her, Thorgistur?
Tell me.
Shall I tell her what your father's been doing?
Welcome to Fargrimr's village. Population 3. The journey there isn't long, but for Senua it is hard, and she's reminded of the world she's left behind while journeying with her 2 new companions. Chapter 3 is where Zynbel formally makes his move, clouding her senses and teasing her for thinking she can save these people that she once hated. But first, let's turn back the clock and talk about Eiltoiga. Standing at 60 feet tall, this thing is one of the best monster designs in the series. A contorted giant with limbs that stretch and flex above, behind and away from her face. Her expression and skin is blackened and burned from wallowing in the crumbling magma hiding beneath Iceland. Shortly before they arrive at the village of Red Hills, she leers down at Senua, seems to understand her, calls her a monster. It's notable that the great beasts that roam Senua's saga are giants, considering Senua has met a giant before. In the first game, Hela towered over us with a half-blackened face. Now, we're in Midgard, the home of man and giant. In Norse mythology, this place has been raised from the foundations of Orgelmir, or Ymir. Orgelmir was the first giant in Norse mythology, born out of the clash between the icy realm of Niflheim and the fiery lands of Muspelheim. From those frozen waters, Orgelmir came to life, setting the stage for the existence of all giants. His body was a bizarre crater of life. A male and female sprung up under his arm, and his legs gave rise to a six-headed son. A cow, Odumla, kept him alive, nourishing him with her milk. Meanwhile, Odumla herself survived by licking salty, frost-covered stones until she revealed a man-shaped form, Buri. He'd go on to become the grandfather of Odin and his brothers, the gods who would later end Orgelmir's life. When they killed him, Orgelmir's blood flooded everywhere, wiping out almost every frost giant. But it didn't stop there. The gods used his body to literally sculpt the world. His flesh became the land, his blood the oceans, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky itself. Even his brain wasn't wasted, turning into the clouds, while his teeth and bones became stones. The gods appointed 4 dwarves to prop up his skull like some cosmic ceiling. And Orgelmir's eyelashes, those became the boundary of Midgard, the home of humanity, a fence around the chaos. In Hellblade 2, Ymir isn't mentioned, but in the reality of Senua's Psychosis, these giants have certainly risen from him, or rather, from the volcano that lies at his heart. Dispensing with the myth, Hellblade 2 eventually makes it clear that the giants were born after a volcanic eruption rocked Iceland to its core. We even get a name for the volcano, Askja, though historically it seems that volcano lay dormant during this period. Instead, Askja's eruption has parallels with the volcanoes Hrafnkatla and Bráurbunga. They did erupt between the 8th and 10th century when Hellblade takes place, resulting in numerous natural disasters that cloaked the country. Iltoiga represents earthquakes. Her name translates as evil nerve, connecting to the pain she's in after losing her baby and bringing about a vision of a landmass that trembles and shudders when disturbed. The ground cracks and rumbles whenever she's near, especially when she chases Senua, Thorgester and Fargrimr from the Draugr camp. But because of the time period, the people of Iceland don't see these disasters as scientific. Instead, they think they're being punished by the gods. The way this is all presented to us ultimately becomes incredibly messy, but for now, the creation of an earthquake giant is impressive in the least and awe-inspiring at the most. This is where Ninja Theory's art team got to flex their muscles. If Iltoiga represents earthquakes, our second giant, Shavarisi, represents tsunamis. His name is less subtle than Iltoiga's, translating directly as sea giant. His design is just as visceral. Pieces of him have fallen off, eroded, rotted away. He's missing fingers, pieces of flesh have dropped into the ocean, and he comes in the thunder and lightning, sadly crashing down on the village he once called home. Hellblade's horror is most acute when we're standing our ground against these beasts, but just like the first game, it's the insidious darkness and beings that lurk in there that herald the horror. I'll pass the mic to Zimbel to explain more.
You can't stop them. You can't kill the giant.
Zimbel / the shadow / the darkness is less threatening now. Not least because the lack of live action means there's nothing alien about his presence. In the first game, bloody red flashes of his abuse lit up the walls when Senua left the light behind. Live action clips of Zimbel beating her. That's now gone, and instead what we get is a ring wraith and a Hot Topic coat. Making Zimbel a distinctly separate entity when he appears weakens his foundation as an earworm burrowing into Senua's mind. It's simply less trippy, less scary and less impactful. There's a question of when Senua's psychosis drowns her. It doesn't feel like this is a condition that's always there now, instead it feels separated from the general world. Here's a psychosis bit, here's a bit in the real Iceland, here's another psychosis bit, and so on. Here, Senua retreats into a cave with her friends, and then suddenly, obviously, we're doing a section in her head where she runs through some spooky woods. In the making of featurette, Senua's Psychosis, Ninja Theory interviewed a peer support worker, Eddie, who also suffers from psychosis. Quote, Senua is experiencing an altered state of reality that would be very difficult to understand if you haven't experienced it yourself or played Hellblade. It's difficult, saying that it's not an illness, that it's not real. Of course to me, it is, and of course to Senua, it is. The sort of psychosis Senua suffers from isn't something that turns on or off, evidenced by the first game. It's more like a dimmer switch. One of the things that made that first game so powerful is how unreliable the world was. We struggled to tell the difference between what's real and what's a hallucination, emulating Senua's own experience, bringing us closer to her, and as a result, closer to the horror she experienced. Take this sequence in the woods. Senua walks into an arena. There are 3 exits. 2 of these exits will result in death. Zimbel will mirthlessly chuckle and swarm us. There's no tell or puzzle to solve, no way to engage with the psychosis. We just need to approach an exit, and if the screen turns a bit red, we know that's not the way out. When the psychosis bits do come, the sequel relies on old tricks from its predecessor. We've seen this before, so the tension is dampened. Placing a torch on a ledge, forcing us to duck underwater before retrieving it. We've done this before. Running from light source to light source while the sound design shrieks and caws in our ear. We've seen this already. Navigating a looping labyrinth. We did this previously. A magical weapon? We seeked one out before. 7 years on from the release of the first game, these tricks and story beats are starting to feel old. But what doesn't is the way sound is used. Suspiciously, Tamim Antoniades, co-founder of Ninja Theory and creative director of Hellblade 1, left the studio shortly before the sequel released. What that meant was audio director David Garcia formed a trifecta of creative leads who headed up the game, joined by environment art director Dan Atwell and visual effects director Mark Slater Tunstill. Naturally, that meant there was no one to hold Garcia back, and he threw himself into elevating Hellblade 2's sound design to inject fear. Quote, most of our sound design starts with a voice library. Senua would always be accompanied by these sounds throughout the whole game. Some of them are very clean and recognizable, and some of them are processed and distorted, depending on Senua's state of mind in that specific moment. When you start to be surrounded by sounds that seem like voices, but you're not very sure if they are, this is where I think your brain starts to feel a sense of dread, and you passively build unsettling emotions. In the village of Chapter 2, we hear the last moments of the souls that the Draugr murdered. A crib lies abandoned in one of the homes, and as Senua approaches, our headphones flare up with the haunting final moments of a mother and her baby. A cruel, optional beat that some players won't find and anyone without headphones won't get to experience. There's a lot to criticize about Hellblade 2, but the sound design is untouchable. Whether it's the whispering wind of the Hidden Folks caves highlighting Senua's isolation, or the rumble and roar of the Draugr reinforcing their threat, Hellblade 2's horror lies in the work of David Garcia and his team. Coming back to the Draugr, it's said that they worship the giants to connect these two supernatural forces as one humongous entity, but it's less that they worship the giants and more that in their madness, our cannibal Vikings have acclimated to the earthquakes, tsunamis and chaos in a way the other residents of Iceland haven't. The terror they bring is punctured when we compare them to the Northmen that bookend the game. The Vikings aren't the antler-eared beasts that have sewn rags to their bare chests anymore. Their faces aren't shrouded by masks to reinforce their alien threat. They're just bald blokes now. The game humanizes the Northmen too quickly. Thorgester says that it wasn't his people who killed Dillion in the first game, but Senua believes that. In fact, she believes it right until the credits roll. Thorgester never tells her the truth, so why does she see these people as the boring men that they are from the get-go and not the terrifying monsters from the first game? By Chapter 6, it makes sense. Senua firmly believes that these are just people deluded by the Goatee's lie, but it's incredibly disappointing that elsewhere we're just fighting normal guys after they were built up so effectively in the first game. It actually weakens the first title in hindsight. I'm not playing a Hellblade game to fight dudes in armor. Where are all the monsters from the first game's concept art? Littering the field with beasties just to have them slowly transform into people would actually reinforce the game's mantra that behind every monster is a man. And speaking of those men,
have you heard of the Hidden Folk?
Hidden folk.
The Hidden Folk?
Yeah.
Have you heard of them?
A secret people, powerful, aloof. Once they were gods or something like, but now they hide themselves in the earth. Even the giants steer clear.
Thorgester's father is feeding the slaves to the giants. It's clear that Thorgester thinks it's a necessary evil to keep the monsters at the door, but Senua resolves to slay the giant. She's killed gods, how difficult can a giant be? Fargrimr calls her a seer, says he's met women like Senua before, people who can see past the veil, and because she's a seer, she might be able to find help from beings he calls the hidden folk. So, we have our plan. Find the hidden folk, slay the giant. Do you want to hear something a little controversial? Chapter 4 is my favourite part of the game. What, the cave? Yes, the cave. It's the only part of the game that A, feels like a game, and B, reminds me of Senua's sacrifice. Yum yum yum, I love Hellblade 1. Guided by unseen voices, Senua heads off on a trial set by the mysterious hidden folk. They have a way to kill the giants, a secret treasure lying in the depths, but to reach it, we'll need to spend an hour solving puzzles. It harks back to the domain of Valravan. We get some alone time with Senua and the Furies, where our warrior actually talks to them. Shh, she says. Quiet now, let me think. There's a neat twist where we end up following a vision of ourselves, future Senua, who ultimately leaves us the torch we need. It's the most blended part of the game, where psychosis and magic start to meld. What really seems to be happening here is Senua goes on a vision quest in some caves, but what the game gives us is a mythical wonderland beyond the realms of Iceland. If you're tiring of the expansive plains elsewhere, this is the section for you.
They question you.
There are 4 types of puzzle in Hellblade 2, a reduction from the first game's 6. Noticing a trend yet? We've already talked about the forest from the last chapter that can barely be called a puzzle, so let's focus on the remaining 3. The rune doors make an underwhelming return, missing the attention to detail that's made them so magical in the past. The landscape will raise up to block Senua's path, boulders, trees and gravel writhe and spin forebodingly. Watching the world rise up to prevent access never stops being impressive. Senua's psychosis blocks her path, forcing her to find patterns in the world. But mechanically, we don't need to look far to see the missteps. In the first village, the rune shapes we need to find are gruesome body parts stained red, making them stand out from the environment in a way that strips back the need to search and interrogate the terrain. It almost seems like the game is embarrassed about these perspective puzzles. Lining up the body parts to form runes is simply too easy. It snaps you to them, effectively handing out the answer with a friendly claw. In an effort to be a cinematic experience, Hellblade 2 is determined to not slow the player down too much, but holistically it would benefit from more friction, and the puzzles on the whole lack it. The second way that the runes are a misstep is more of a minor nitpick, a smudge of detail, but for nerds like me it's deafening. The runes aren't runes. Not really. They're shapes. The first game made a point of using the Elder Fultar alphabet for its runes, so there was a historic baseline that flagged how Senua's worldview was coloured in by the Norse stories Druth told her. But that was just half the story. The runes that came up in Hellblade 1 would connect to corresponding story beats. Manaz, for example, has connotations of the self, support, assistance, and family, and arises whenever Galena or Druth interrupt the tale. In Hellblade 2, the symbols Senua needs to find don't mean anything. They are cool-looking nonsense.
Where are they? Where are you?
What do they want?
I don't like it.
I'm scared.
This is too much.
The other 2 puzzle types are introduced in this chapter as a means of uncovering the hidden folk. The game never uses this term explicitly, but it's clear that they're fae, fairy folk, as mischievous and dark as the old fables describe them. Fairy circles are drawn in the soil and carved out on stone orbs that we need to collect. The main challenge here is that we need to change the world around us to get to those orbs. And it's also the main challenge the game has with keeping me engaged. With these puzzles, the world gets reflected on top of itself, meaning the dirt of the floor replaces the open sky, forming a mirror of a cave. Visually, this is fantastic. It means Hellblade 2's puzzle box design necessitates environmental design that can lend itself to the puzzle. The world is built for the puzzle rather than the puzzle just laid on top of the world. Just like the rune doors, this is conceptually incredible. What's also incredible is how quickly the environment can change. Water orbs hang in the air that Senua needs to focus on, and when she does, a ledge will swap from the floor to the roof or vice versa. It's a system very similar to the plot board in Alan Wake 2, and just like there, it's breathtaking. But to compare these two mechanics is to see the holes in how Hellblade 2 approaches it. In Alan Wake 2, there's a wide area designated for changing the environment, a full room or a few square meters of a subway station. You're not forced to stand still when a change happens, so there's freedom offered to a player. If you're in the wrong place when you change the environment, you'll mess up the puzzle and need to start over. Spatial awareness is key. In Hellblade 2, Senua can only focus on these water orbs from one place and one angle because the experience is so linear. Many times these puzzle box rooms are effectively an on-rails orb spotter where you walk from point A to point B, focus on the orb and go back to point A. Again, there's just a lack of friction. It's uncertain how these orbs connect to Senua's psychosis either. The rune puzzles at least pretend to be part of Senua's obsession with Norse mythology, so you can connect the dots that lead her psychosis to hallucinate them. But I don't know what the relevance of water orbs are, or why looking at them changes the world. If Psychosis is all about seeing bizarre patterns, I'm not sure what the pattern is that makes Senua think up water orbs. All three puzzle types come back to perspective, a Hellblade staple and something that's specifically important in this sequel. Senua's power comes from her ability to think outside the box, to see the world in a way that others don't. The Northmen think the giants have to be killed, but soon Senua will see things differently, noticing the men behind the monsters. It's beautiful and makes the game's themes feel fuller somehow, at least until the cracks appear in the closing chapters. Our final puzzle, that involves lighting torches to, again, change the environment, returns to that emphasis on perspective. We need to map out an imaginary route and then light the flames that make that route corporeal. But it's a real shame that the fantastic perspective puzzles from the first game, where we need to view fractured parts of an object in the right way to make it heal, don't come back. That was a really clever, really freeing piece of design that put the onus on the player to find the right height, the right perspective to repair something like a bridge. Their absence is strange in Hellblade 2, especially because of how naturally it would slot into the game's message.
What would you do to change? What would you do to survive? You cannot kill the giants. Secrets fester in the darkness.
As reward for completing the Hidden Folks trials, Senua learns the secret to stopping the giants. It's not a sword this time. That was a delicately handled red herring where the twist is that the blade Senua finds in here is the one that she entered with. No, the way to stop the giants is by naming them. The Hidden Folk leads Senua to the corpse of Ultoiga's baby and we learn her real name, Ingun, translating to loving or to love. The plan is to undertake a ritual that will transport Senua to Ultoiga's domain, a volcanic cave beneath the countryside. But hold the phone, Senua, I'm not done moaning about your puzzles. Here's the thing about the game's puzzles. Often, the only puzzle really is, how do I get to that place? And often, the obvious answer is, by jumping down this tiny cliff, stupid. But Senua can't jump down this tiny cliff, so she needs to run all the way around to find a torch, or some water in the sky, look at it, and change the environment to open a path. There are problems with this. In Hellblade 1, tiny cliffs were never the obstacle when it came to puzzles. Senua's psychosis meant that a door was suddenly locked with magical runes that she needed to identify in the world. This was effective because without her psychosis, Senua would be able to just open the door. But in Hellblade 2, Senua's psychosis isn't stopping her from jumping down this tiny cliff. The game is. The obstacles aren't always contextualized by her condition. Sometimes the cliff is climbable and sometimes it isn't. The only thing that separates them is a bit of white paint. This isn't friction in the name of Psychosis, it's frustrating game design that shows the code behind the world. Dominic Matthews said, "Our focus is, how do we make a game that is great to play, that's a compelling experience, and that people love? If, as a byproduct, we can help people understand Psychosis a little more, then fantastic." But the tiny cliff dilemma means these puzzles aren't great to play or a compelling experience or, unfortunately, help me understand Psychosis a little more. All the realistic visuals in the world can't combat the moment when I started questioning the game design and the immersion shattered.
Give it to her. Her baby. She just wanted to protect what she loved.
Illteuga's confrontation is a spectacular sequence that I wouldn't call a boss or even a puzzle. The music is timed with her outburst and attacks, and we need to run from cover to cover, getting close enough to break her massive chains. The lesson here is that she became a monster because she was consumed by rage, a lesson that the game thinks Senua needs to learn. But we've hardly seen Senua consumed by rage, so it lacks weight or dimension. She was unable to kill the first slave master she came across. Illteuga's one of those rare situations where I think it would have benefited from longer loading times after dying. At least then it would feel punishing. But Senua just gets shot back to the last piece of cover she sheltered in with a snap of our fingers, so you can technically brute force it. There are no enemies to fight, no real challenge, and it would be a neat section if it was unique. But as we'll soon see, Hellblade repeats this trick again to minimal returns. But naming the giant, she crumbles away. Fargrimr always believed, but Thorgestr is in shock. Somebody might finally be able to rid his people of this hell. Senua makes him promise no more slaves and no more sacrifices. He's a true believer now. The gang journey on to his home, hoping to speak to his father, the Goatee. We've got a lot of ground to cover before the end, and the game isn't leaving us much time to talk about it. There's a moment here, in Chapter 5, that we can go off the beaten path and find a beautiful rock with white paint on it. We hop over the rock and jog ahead for 30 seconds, just to learn there's nothing at the end of this path. Nothing to see, no vista shot, no rune to find, no collectibles to uncover. I can't think of a better example of Hellblade 2's world design.
There is a settlement nearby.
Bothervik.
Yes.
Are you mad? They will kill me on sight. They hate the Björk. They've been pains in our asses since long before the fall.
And do you think you might have given them a cause to hate you?
The settlement of Bothervik stands between us and Thorgestr's people. It's a fishing village, the last bastion of good people not sacrificing kinsmen to the giants. With our first monster conquered and the hidden folk supporting our cause, Senua starts to see Iceland differently. She sees the beauty in the vast plains, caves, tunnels, and caves. The first game's land of mist and fog was a gargantuan wheel that toppled and folded in on itself, built around a gigantic wooden sculpture of a horse that crashed out of the ocean, acting as a gateway to Hela's domain. Orkney was transformed completely through Senua's eyes. Uncertainty came from trying to distinguish what was simply a magical fantasy setting and what was part of Senua's hallucination. Iceland is very different. There isn't a shadow of a doubt of what's real because it looks and feels real. It's beautiful. The trails and paths that we walk or lightly jog across stretch off into the infinite. It looks vast, it looks tantalizing, and it's all real. Until the game smash cuts to something that isn't, like the Grove of the Hidden Folk or the crater where Illteuga resides. The environment of Chapter 3 is shattered with craters and cracks in the ground. The Furies tell us it's Illteuga's footsteps, her prints, scarring the landscape underneath. But what we're looking at are the results of earthquakes. The volcano, Askja, is forever burning in the distance of vista shots, a solemn and consistent reminder of the natural disaster that started Midgard's descent into madness. Ninja Theory went to Iceland to map it out. 21 locations, 2,500 kilometers over 11 days. They combined the experience of standing in Iceland, of feeling the wind as it blows between volcanic molds in the rock, with photogrammetry to make sure the Iceland they were creating was as realistic as possible. In one of the development diaries, Dan Atwell said, "Photogrammetry gives you that added level of detail and believability. Reference is key. We don't want to make what we think it looks like, we want to get as much reference gathering as possible and be as faithful as possible to what the real thing would have looked like. Listen Iceland, no offence, your country is beautiful, but it's no land of mist and fog. I am saying that as a Scotsman, so there's a wee bit of bias there, but what does Senua's Iceland look like? What distinguishes it from the vast plains that I can visit today? Hellblade 1 transformed Orkney into a mythical realm, into hell. Hellblade 2 turns Iceland into Iceland. The emphasis on realism actually gets in the way of what makes Hellblade such a feast for the eyes. This looks like Iceland. It's impressive technically, but is that enough? Just like how the Northmen are now highly detailed, gorgeously animated, normal guys, Iceland is a highly detailed, gorgeously animated, normal place. And that's not enough for a sequel to a game that explored how Psychosis skews every inch of an environment. One more quote from Dan Atwell for you. The level of realism that we're aiming for will really help with the immersion of the experience. It kinda stops you from questioning the space you're in. But I am constantly questioning the space I'm in because of how the team have approached exploration. It's not a question of what's over there, it's a question of can I go there? Better check. And the answer is typically no, with progress halted by invisible walls and ledges we can't drop down. When it is yes, we're faced with scenarios like this path in Chapter 5. The detail that made the first game such a feat is still here, but it's in all the wrong places. I don't care how good this rock looks, I want to see stuff like Hela's face on a shield again. I want the runes that block our progress to mean something. I want to see a fictional Iceland that rivals fictional Orkney, seen through Senua's eyes rather than my own, in a way that's fluid and makes me uncertain about how much of this is real. Oh, but look at that rock though. It's a world built to be looked at, not interacted with. I made the joke that Fargrimr's village only has 3 people living in it, but really, that's not a joke. We hear 2 people total gossiping about Senua and Thorgestr arriving, but aside from that, we don't really get to build a relationship with the people that Senua fights for. Iceland might look real, but it doesn't feel alive. It's when we meet Astridr that Hellblade 2 tries to remedy that.
Guiding the Björk to our door, She knows them. How is this what you've been reduced to? How does she know them? Why does she hate them?
Let him go!
No. Who is this woman?
Astridr, this is not what you think.
What then? She was slit his throat. What is it?
Astridr is the de facto leader of Barrvik. She's the final member of our troop and comes with so much potential that is unfortunately wasted because the game has barely 90 minutes left. She's doubtful of her ability to kill the giants, despises Thorgestr because his people have attacked her town in the past, but invites us into her home anyway, willing to hear us out. It turns out a second giant, Sjavarisi, has clawed its way out of the ocean and is ravaging her people. We have our second target. Despite how slow the game is, the characters aren't given much time to breathe, and unfortunately, that means they all come away as pretty one note. Astridr specifically is introduced so late that we don't get enough time with her, and ultimately she should be the companion that Senua bonds with the most. 2 warriors fueled by rage because they lost people to the Bjorg. 2 warriors who learned to fight by watching the men of their village. 2 warriors who saw a loved one die at the hands of a man they trusted. Hellblade 2 introduces these purposeful parallels here, but doesn't do anything after introducing them. It feels like she's been set up as a mentor of sorts for Senua. Really, she's the only character who displays true leadership, a quality Senua needs to learn before the credits roll. It's her who's led her tribe through hardship. It's her who's gained her people's respect. It's her who displays clear mastery of the terrain. Laborious animations be damned. I mean, look how quickly she scales this cliff. Can we play as her instead? Jumping ahead to the very beginning of Chapter 6, Senua, Astridr, Thorgestr, and Fargrimr head into the Forest of Shadow, a location that's introduced with ominous groans and whispers by our fellowship. It's haunted, people are eaten by the woods, and those that aren't return changed.
What do you know about this place?
This place is nothing special.
There's something malevolent in here.
Something evil.
Something you can't fight.
You might be thinking this is going to be a substantial section where the Fellowship start to finally bond. Maybe they'll share a story around a campfire before entering the forest. Maybe Senua's sight will give her glimpses of the pain that our companions all individually carry, but it ends up being nothing. There isn't combat in here, or a puzzle. The game doesn't seize the opportunity it gifts itself to flesh out its characters. This isn't the Forest of Shadow, this is the Forest of Characterization, with hardly any characterization in it. Fargrimr is haunted by his wife and child for less than 20 seconds. Astridr gets terrified when we lose her, but it's less than 2 minutes of game time before we find her again. There's a beat where it looks like we need to make a choice between joining Fargrimr or Astridr, and the Furies hush in our ear that we made a bad choice. Ooh, but then 10 seconds later, everyone gets reunited. Thorgestr is the only companion who's afforded an arc, which is likely why he comes away as the only character anyone remembers the name of. We're with him the longest, and his journey from blind believer to doubter to martyr is a compelling one. In these woods, he gets a vision of something terrible, a vision that his father won't listen to Senua, a vision that he would die at his father's hands. It chills him, humanizes him, The section is likely here to show why Senua is the only one of the four who can lead Iceland into a new dawn, but that isn't taught through mechanics or environment because Hellblade's world design is uninterested in going beyond the photogrammetry or a few pity puzzles tossed into the middle. Let's stay in these woods and take an example.
There is no way through.
We have to go back.
In the Forest of Shadow is a blocked path. There's an easy way around that blocked path, we hop up this ledge. But the gang all start to panic. There's no way through, they bark. Get your weapons ready! Can they not climb ledges either? They just stand around, waiting for us to walk behind some trees. There's no player input outside of following the yellow brick road. Chapter 6 purposefully has no collectibles to uncover, a baffling exclusion because the Forest of Shadow is the perfect place to litter them. At least this way we could let ourselves get lost, eking out the length of the forest to make it feel like a substantial portion of the game with weight. But then again, why even bother exploring when the game keeps regulating your speed, right?
The Skald's verse speaks of a man called Grettir the Strong. A strange and bloody life he led. And it happened in this land you have come to.
Hellblade 2 splits Druth's 44 lore stones into two types of collectibles. 18 lore stangear and 17 trees of the hidden folk. It's comforting to hear Druth's tales again, and through finding them all, Senua remembers the tale of Grettir, an old Norse legend who battled monsters of all kinds, especially Draugr. If you want to uncover the lore stangear, you'll need to drag Senua away from her walking speed and step off the main path. You'll see it in the footage on screen now. I am holding down the sprint button, but the game seems to magnetize Senua to the trail of whatever NPC she's traveling with as if it's trying to tell us not to explore. As wonderful as Druth's tales are, they fall into the same pit as the rune doors that block off puzzle rooms. In the first game, finding every runestone spelled out the game's ultimate reveal, translating directly to English as "Seek Hell's truth in mirror, gods betray us, unmask fear." But finding all of the lore stones in the sequel doesn't translate to anything because they don't have corresponding runes, just bizarre squiggles. They're not Elder Fultark, nor Younger Fultark, or Germanic Elder Fultark, or Anglo-Saxon Fultark. Don't look at me like that, we all have our hobbies. I think what all of this, the see don't touch design, the speed regulation, the apparent puzzles solved by walking forwards, and the runestones that no longer have coded secret messages, what it all tells me is that Hellblade 2 doesn't have an awareness of the player, or if it does, it doesn't care. Participation isn't the point, the same way it was in the first game. The secret message in the runestones put us in Senua's headspace, finding secret codes and patterns in the world. The game directly tricked the player by outright telling us that it had a permadeath mode when it didn't. There is nothing like that in Hellblade 2. Well, except for one thing.
In the heart of the Northlands, they know the storms are born of the Oshkuredi, the hunt of Odin. The huntsmen ride horses with eyes of fire.
The trees of the hidden folk are the best part of the game. Rocks in the form of hidden faces can be focused on to illuminate a short path leading to beautiful trees and a short fable told to us by the hidden folk. It's participatory, requiring us to interrogate the world design. Theme through mechanics comes through really strongly here, showing Senua's ability to find beauty in the world, to see things in a different way. When she focuses on the decrepit trees, they heal, flourishing with life. And the final tree ultimately tells us the story of Jarl Hakon, a man who sacrificed his son for the giants to gain their aid in battle, a major piece of foreshadowing. It's inspired, with stories that don't just hyper-focus on Norse mythology, but talk about fables from across the globe. Stories not just from Iceland, but from Scotland as well, to remind her of her heritage in a Norse-driven epic.
When it all went to hell, people started coming to us for help. We were just barely scraping by, but she doesn't like to remember. We opened our doors to them. She's trying to help.
If Iltoiga was once a grieving mother wandering the world after the volcano wiped out her people, Shavarisi was the right-hand man and eventual traitor to Astrator's clan. Initially he stood with his friends, but one day the Bjorg, Thorgester's people, took the inhabitants of the fishing village as slaves. He sold out the leader of his clan to the Bjorg, Astrator's father. The tribe found out, and when they did, they didn't kill him. Instead, Astrator cast him from her home. The sea took him, turned him into a giant, and spat him back onto the shore. It's Astrator who tells Senua the giant's true name, Saegir. We have everything we need to confront him. It's just a shame that there's no agency here to glue us to Senua. Facing Sciavarisi is as overly scripted and visually breathtaking as we've come to expect from elsewhere in the game. It's really a shame that Ninja Theory spoiled the most spectacular part of Hellblade 2 in a reveal trailer, because in the end, watching a trailer of this sequence is no different from playing it. Our inputs are minimal. Sciavarisi hides in a cave on the shoreline. Senua leads some of Astradar's fiercest warriors inside, and we douse him with oil, setting him ablaze as he mewls and groans. But throwing our spear at the giant is scripted. Even if you don't push the button, Senua will just do it herself. We can't turn around to look at him during the chase sequence, and it's impossible to run from the burning torches that we need to pick up to finish the job. There is a fail state. If we don't hold down the sprint function, Senua will get crushed, but player freedom is what grants us immersion, not a railroad of high fidelity and pretty fire. Again, I'm questioning what the game wants me to do, rather than what Senua wants to do in this moment. His formal confrontation doesn't fare much better. It repeats the same gimmick as Ultoiga, with less interactivity rather than more. We run from post to post as water threatens to drown us. The game pretends to up the intensity by making some of those posts break with a more intense animation, but there's no true difficulty curve in these sequences. That intensity is artificial, so as a player, I don't feel it. Senua gets respawned immediately, just a couple feet away from where she's hit if you fail. And because the level is so handholdy, there are points where it feels like I'm protected from the water, but I'm not. If you're not following the single scripted path, you're not following any path at all.
She doesn't.
Can you keep going?
She is so hurt, so broken. She needs to see.
The biggest fight is ahead.
Always.
The giant of Borgavarki is strong.
We are
But I believe in you.
Despite the faith Iceland's people have placed in her, Senua still feels uncertain about her role as their savior. Zynbel growls to her, telling her that all of the death is because of her and her darkness. Christ, get a better line, pal. Everything has been building to this, a confrontation with Thorgester's father, the Goti. A gross goblin of a man sits on his throne and is baffled when Thorgester presents Senua to him, thinking we're a gift, a concubine from a distant land.
All we need to do is feed the giants with lives that don't matter, because they're not our own, not us, not real.
On a second playthrough, we can replace the head Fury as narrator. Thorgester, Fargrimr, Astradar and the Goti step in to apparently flesh out the finer details and clue us into more of Hellblade 2's story. There are two problems with this. The first is that these other voices, the voices of Senua's companions, take away from the personal, intimate, and yes, immersive experience of playing as Senua. The second is that, speaking as someone who has played the game 3 times, I can wholeheartedly tell you that these narrators change nothing. A second playthrough is a waste. Let's break down the new stuff we learn. Thorgester did not lead the raid on Dillion's clan in the first game. Astradar may have had romantic feelings for Saegir. The Goti justifies his tyrannical rule and his sacrifices to the giants by claiming, "All I ever wanted was for my people to be safe." He tells us that he did this by, quote, "sacrificing people who didn't matter." He sucks. He is a man beyond redemption. In the dark fantasy of Hellblade's world, he joins Zynbel as the very definition of a monster. A man who lacks empathy, seeing the slaves as subhuman. A stark image greets us outside the settlement of Bjorgavakr. A howling blizzard has cloaked the fortress. Senua and Astradar's people are strapped to poles, waiting to be fed to the giant who stalks these lands. Tyrant. The Goti isn't just trying to pacify the giants, he's also made a deal with our Viking cannibals, the Draugr. After a full game where we've been encouraged to look past the monstrous and see the people underneath, look at things in a different way, the Goti stands as a direct refutation of that message. He is, frankly, not worth looking past. He's unwilling to learn, solely responsible for the deaths of thousands, and even when a second playthrough tries to let us do that, we learn nothing that humanizes him. Just his disgusting belief system that proves how dangerous he really is. The game even capitalizes on all this by making him kill Thorgester before he can be redeemed. And because he refutes the game's overarching theme, I don't know if that's where Hellblade 2 wants me to be by the end. If it is, I'm not sure what the point is. Behind every monster is a man, Senua. Except for this guy, he fucking sucks. It's after the Goti tries to sacrifice us to our third giant that the game lays its twist bare, and the narrative starts to crumble like sand. Not just from a logical perspective, but from an emotional, thematic, and cathartic one as well.
He wanted to hold on to that strength, to hold his place in their hearts, their wills. So he made the giants, brought them forth from the shaking earth, the roaring sea, the blinding snow, brought them into being.
The Gothi invented the giants. There is no third gargantuan being. Thorgester's father is the third giant. He's the tyrant. After the volcano erupted, he spun tales and stories to his people, and when he saw the power that afforded him, he built the giants up as a bedtime story that resulted somehow in mass hysteria that spanned the country of Iceland. The monsters we've encountered so far do not exist. So let's unpack how Hellblade 2 delivers SENUA'S Psychosis, and what this means for the franchise as a whole. Let's start with the good stuff. Making each giant a parallel for the natural disasters that shook Iceland is a stroke of genius. When it was just subtext, when it was just a way of interpreting the story, when it was just a thematic element that runs as an undercurrent to the monsters that Senua battles. It's funny because when I spoke to Gaming University about what we might expect from Hellblade 2, I effectively predicted that a volcanic eruption would be what drives Senua to cross the sea and journey to the land of the Northmen.
They're not, staying 100% historically accurate. But if you're looking at the timeline that they set up for when they claim this game takes place, a volcano erupts within that century in Iceland. And it's this huge, devastating volcano that basically just cocked up Iceland completely. So
interesting.
My thought is probably that Hellblade 1 ends. Senua goes off into, off back to civilization, finds a new village, does whatever she does after she comes to terms with Dillion's death. And she reunites with a new village, this strong warrior queen, basically she's just fought a bunch of gods, so she's pretty strong in some sense, even if it's just mentally. And she says, right, we're going to take the war back to the Northmen, because the eruption, the volcanic eruption, ended up basically cocking up Orkney as well. It cocked up the island where the first game is, or well, she grew up. That volcano caused just this whole environmental eruption in the ecosystem, and people died off just due to the smoke, etc., etc. And I think that Senua comes back and goes, guys, they're sending evil smoke gods to us, or something along those lines, and we are taking the fight to them. I think it's going to be a bit of, what happens when you follow a leader who is so in their own head and has such one sole single focus. I mean, I'm pulling that from, a very vague knowledge of when a volcano erupted, the fact they went to Iceland, one scary trailer where she's chanting, and a gameplay trailer where she's fighting giants with people. That's all I've got for that, but that's currently the theory I'm sitting on until we get any more information.
So yes, this is all my fault, I'm so sorry. The giants being presented as individual elements grounds Hellblade's setting in historical fantasy, and the series is at its best when you can see the path from real event to Senua's perception. We can trace the power of this in how she defeats the giants. Both Iltoiga and Sjavarisi are beings in pain. Iltoiga especially is defined by a traumatic event, the death of her child. Naming things is a powerful therapeutic technique that lays the groundwork for healing. Just think of how Senua calls the voices in her head the Furies, or the peoples of Iceland call Viking cannibals Draugr. Richard Makeover discussed this in his piece The Power of Naming. Quote, merely naming a set of symptoms provides clarity and a focus of exploration. Renaming is an intervention that helps define a therapeutic problem in a more accessible manner. Ultimately, that is the power that Senua has, the power to rename something and redefine it for Iceland's people. Senua sees Iltoiga and, by looking at her through the lens of her personal psychosis, renames her as a tragic figure, taking away what makes her so terrifying to Fargrimr or Thorgester. It's a great solution to the threat of the giants, a therapeutic tool that Senua trips into using. With me so far? Great. So what's bad about this? Well, how long do you have? Purely from a structural perspective, the giant twist feels like it was bolted on last minute. It doesn't feel like something the game has been building to, and it's primarily on consecutive playthroughs, something the game encourages with the different narrators, that this is most obvious. In Chapter 2, Fargrimr says this.
I led my people here, promised them a new life,
Called this home.
an escape from the madness and misery across the sea. For some time we were happy.
Like us. We were happy until him.
Then Volcano and the darkness came.
It's planted firmly in the ground all the way back at the start. The Fargrimr knows that the volcano erupted. Going back to the power of naming, he's able to name the volcano, identify it as a fiery piece of landmass that causes natural disasters. Why does Fargrimr recognize that a volcano is a natural disaster, but thinks earthquakes and tsunamis are supernatural? That'd be like being able to identify a glass of water, but thinking a glass of lemonade is God's piss. Segmenting the rituals as these moments where Senua jumps into the reality of the giants is cool and all, but it distinctly separates the Psychosis bits from the Iceland bits. Meaning it's not that Senua's Psychosis skews Iceland as a world, transforming it into Midgard, it simply exists to give us game-isms. It robs these epic moments of their epicness in hindsight. Senua never unchained a giant from a fiery realm. She never raced into the heart of a tornado. Instead, you're left alone with your imagination while wondering, well, what were they doing instead then? It's an age of shared delusion, something this game and the last game definitely reinforce. It's a world where mentally ill women are burned as a witch, where cannibals are viewed as supernatural Draugr. What's the difference between Senua's Psychosis and the sort of mass delusion that we can trace throughout history? It's a great question for this sequel to ask, but there's no rationality to how it's answered, so it's just confusing. And Hellblade can be confusing, that is fine. In the first game it's part of the fun, but there's a delicate balance that has to be struck. With that first game, you can find numerous answers and interpretations to your questions that can all be correct at the same time. Senua pulls a magical sword from a tree, or she finds the sword she dropped earlier. Senua battles Valravn deep in the woods, a being that stalked her in the past. Or she relives her training under Druth on a vision quest. In Hellblade 2, we get our answer and the ambiguity is lost, so all that's left are the cracks that make this twist kinda dumb. I've seen takes online that Hellblade 2 doesn't need to explicitly explain the giants and the mass psychosis. Both of these things can be true at the same time. The giants can be real and a result of the psychosis. But these two things cannot be true at the same time by the game's own explicit admission. The giants aren't real. That's not subtext, that is in the text. The GOTY, and by extension the game, tells us this as a big dramatic reveal. He openly confesses that he made them up to assert his power and control after the volcano erupted and everything went to chaos. Magic and psychosis can exist at the same time, of course, but the game states outright that the giants and the psychosis do not. The giants aren't real. In its determination to give the player these concrete answers that ruins the mystery of this series, Hellblade 2 inadvertently spoils Hellblade 1, and I actually think that's its greatest sin. This game explains that game. Fargrimr comments that the ones she fought before, they were her own monsters, confirming that there were exactly 0 gods and 0 Northmen in the first game, and the whole thing was in Senua's head. If the Northmen weren't real, who's to say any of it was? I guess Senua's sacrifice was a dream all along. The giants not being real leads to some serious questions and contradictions that the game seems to be intensely proud of, despite the fact there is no possible explanation that is satisfying. I can get behind the idea that Iceland's people believe an earthquake or a tsunami is supernatural, even if Fargrimr's clarity makes his participation in the mass hysteria kind of silly. But what I can't get behind is dozens of people running around a beach throwing spears at rocks. Not only does it make this cool moment really crap and frankly hilarious in hindsight, but also if we combine the clumsiness of this structure with the existence of the gameplay trailer, it shows that Ninja Theory came up with cool visual concepts before they figured out what this story should be. This footage I'm showing you is from that reveal trailer, and it has distinct differences from the gameplay sequence we eventually got. In fact, this was one of the first things Ninja Theory came up with before the rest of the game took shape. Dominic Matthews told Kinda Funny Games, quote, "It's a visual showcase. I'm really proud of that. Cool trailer visuals first, everything else second." Historically, mass hysteria has drummed up in small, isolated communities. Think of the most well-known example of this condition, the dancing plague of Strasbourg in the 16th century. Professor Simon Wesley in his paper Mass Hysteria, Two Syndromes, argues that often mass hysteria that spreads outside of these communities has a secondary cause. Hellblade 2's big budget scope is at odds with its message then. The game spans Iceland, jumping from community to community. Each chapter ends with a vast panning shot of the wild plains of Iceland to show just how far Senua and her companions have travelled off screen. From coast to coast if the geographic locations of the village of Red Hills and Bjorgavíkur line up with their environmental design. I could absolutely believe that all of the Bjorg Thorg believed in giants under the iron rule of the Goti, but I cannot believe that this mass hysteria would spread to somewhere like the village of Red Hills and still be accepted by those communities. Historically, there's no precedent for that because again, it is simply silly. And in a Hellblade game, that is not how I should be describing its presentation of mental illness. What exactly did Thorgestr witness Senua do in Chapter 4? After we defeat Iltoiga, he's prepared to cleanse himself of a decade-long brainwashing. But if the giants aren't real, all Senua did was sit in some grass, chant a bit, and tell everyone she stopped the giant. What's the foundation for that hallucination? What about the people that the Goti sacrifices to the tyrant? These people are tied to poles overnight, and the expectation is that tyrant will eat them and leave the settlement in peace. So what happens when the guards go out the next morning and every slave is still there, just frozen to death and tied to the post? And what is this tribe of people fighting on the beach? Are they just screaming at the ocean?
Mad woman.
Their eyes everywhere can feel them boring into her.
Witch.
What is she supposed to do? Do something. Ask them.
What do you want me to do?
This is all saying nothing of how Hellblade approaches Senua's personal psychosis. In an attempt to find the beauty in her hallucinations, the game goes too far, ultimately turning it into a superpower. The hidden folk call her a mad woman, a witch, a hero, but wasn't the message of the first game that she's a hero despite her psychosis rather than because of it? You know what Hellblade 1 was about? It was about how psychosis sucks and it made us experience that alongside Senua. This sucks, I thought. How does anyone handle this? Well, the game said through Senua's characterization and its presentation, they just do. Isn't that amazing? Instead, Hellblade 2's message seems to be, if only more people suffered from psychosis, the world would be a better place. After all, Senua's actual psychosis, this condition that she's forever cursed with, is ultimately what lets her save the day. And I'm not sure that is particularly helpful. Ninja Theory partnered with Professor Paul Fletcher again to make sure they handled psychosis with emphasis and tact. There were numerous interviews and a whole featurette flagging how involved he and the Cambridgeshire Recovery College were in the game's look, or how the voices were used. But I am not convinced that they were consulted on the narrative. I think if they were, they would have pointed out how this is a clumsy and tenuous link to make at best, and hurtful at worst. On a second playthrough, Thorgestr points out that Senua isn't the only one who sees things, hears things, comparing the gaslighting of his father to her psychosis. But mass hysteria isn't the same thing as psychosis. For a start, mass hysteria is temporary, evidenced by every single character in this game. Senua will never be free of her condition, something she had to come to terms with by the end of the first Hellblade. It's what made it so inspirational. This is the thing that I think really tanks Hellblade 2 as a sequel. The removal of mechanics, or the overemphasis on visuals, are just a drop in the ocean compared to how dramatically I think Hellblade 2 drops the ball narratively. I could have sat through a 5-hour walking sim if the writing made me feel half as emotional as the first game did. Instead, it just baffled me, right until the credits rolled.
And Senua knew then where her fate was leading her. She understood the Gothi, saw how she could choose that same path. In the name of others, in order to save them, what would she not do? She is her father's daughter.
In his last moments, Thorgestr tells us the Gothi's true name. Tyrant is unmasked as Alafir, a little man who wields a massive claymore that deals massive damage. This is a boss fight, albeit a highly scripted one. We can't refill our slow meter until pre-planned moments, but as an epic conclusion to the story, it feels momentous. His people see him for what he is, gathering around and cheering Senua on. Even in his final moments, he rants about how the slaves don't deserve to live. Senua knocks him to the ground, raises a rock high in the air, and the plot stops. The game ends with a whimpering suddenness that, on my first playthrough, took me by surprise. When the credits rolled, I thought I'd done something wrong, accidentally skipped a cutscene. Zimbel returns and hisses in our ear, "What would you do to keep these people from harm?" goading her into finishing the job, into killing the monster. So, does she? We don't know. The game positions this scene as Senua resisting seduction by the dark side. As a voice, Zimbel is a cruel, evil, unreliable bastard, so as a rule, we shouldn't do what he says ever. She's linked to Thorgester in this way. Both of them were raised by monsters and are determined not to become them. She won't become a monster. She won't kill the Godi and replace him as a tyrant. But on the other hand, her hands are covered in blood here. On the other hand, this scene is supposed to reflect the opening, when she held the rock over Thorgester's head and chose to spare him. Will she spare someone again? Or will she make a different choice this time? In traditional narratives, a reflection like this would be to show how far a character has come. Leaving point A and reaching point B, they make a different choice to show what they've learned. Senua considers the power she could amass by replacing the Godi. Leading these people that she barely knows, nearly fed her to the giants, and no longer even has Thorgester here to represent her among them. What makes Senua so special? What makes her the one to lead these people? Is it her compassion? Because Astrader showed compassion and empathy when she didn't kill the traitor who murdered her father. Is it her sight? Because Fargrimr showed he's able to see past the mass hysteria when he discussed the volcano, and showed he can see the world beyond when he told Senua about the existence of the hidden folk. Here's the tragic part. I just don't care, because I haven't had time to be invested in these people or their cause. All I'm invested in is Senua, and I don't even get to see where that journey takes her, because as we finish up, watching these many grotesque hands reach out to her in this gorgeous shot, leaning on her, the game just ends, replacing catharsis with beautiful visuals. At least the game stayed true to itself right until the end. At least, the rocks were pretty.
Everything was coming up. Everything was going fine. Yeah. Everything was coming along at its own pace and its own time. Don't know just what to say. My baby ran away with a folk singer from outer space. They're not as cool as you think. Life back on Earth is okay, and now you're flying away at the speed of light. Thought I had it figured out. I thought I had my ducks in a row. Then when I was driving to work, a folk singer popped up on the radio. I don't know just what to say. My baby ran away with a folk singer from outer space. They're not as cool as you think. Life back on Earth is okay, and now you're flying away at the speed of light, at the speed of light, at the speed of light.